Dr. Samuel Johnson stepped into the bustling hospital, his eyes scanning the grand lobby as he took in the new environment. He had been looking forward to this day for weeks, but now that it was here, there was a nervous flutter in his chest. It wasn't just any hospital. It was one of the most prestigious in the city, a place that had long been known for its excellence in medical care. Samuel had earned his place here after years of hard work, dedication, and overcoming the obstacles that had been placed in his path. He was the new chief surgeon, a title that had taken him a lifetime to achieve. At 42, Samuel had already made a name for himself in the medical field. His reputation preceded him. A gifted surgeon with a compassionate heart, and someone who always made his patients feel seen and heard. But no matter how many degrees or accolades he held, no matter how many successful surgeries he had performed, he was still a black man in a world where people often judged him by the color of his skin before his qualifications. And that's what made this hospital different. Or at least, that's what he had hoped. As he walked through the halls, he couldn't help but notice the stares. Some were curious, others judgmental. A few doctors greeted him with forced smiles, their eyes betraying an underlying tension. He had encountered these moments before, the quiet suspicion that came with being an outsider in a predominantly white institution. He had learned long ago to ignore it, to walk with his head held high and his mind focused on his purpose. But today it felt different. Today it felt heavier. Samuel paused as he reached the staff lounge. He was supposed to meet the senior medical staff here, but he wasn't sure what to expect. He had been told the team was top-notch, with some of the best surgeons and specialists in the field. But there was always the question of how they would receive him. Would they see him as a leader? Or would they dismiss him as just another token black face, placed there to fill a quota? Dr. Johnson, a voice interrupted his thoughts. Samuel turned to see a tall, sharply dressed man walking towards him with a confident stride. His face was familiar. It was Dr. Thomas Bradley, one of the senior surgeons Samuel had heard so much about during the interview process. Dr. Bradley, Samuel said with a smile, extending his hand. It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person. Bradley took his hand, his grip firm, but slightly colder than Samuel had expected. Likewise, he said, his voice smooth and professional. I've heard a lot about you, Dr. Johnson. It's good to have you here. Samuel couldn't quite read the man's expression, but he sensed a subtle tension in the air. Bradley's smile didn't quite reach his eyes, and there was something about his posture, stiff, almost defensive, that made Samuel pause for a moment. Still, he brushed it off. He had dealt with much worse, and he wasn't going to let a little awkwardness ruin his first day. Shall we get started? Bradley asked, leading him toward the meeting room. As they walked, Samuel couldn't help but notice the quiet whispers that followed them. A few doctors exchanged looks, quickly glancing away when they noticed Samuel's gaze. It was subtle, but it was there. He had learned to tune out these little microaggressions, but today they seemed louder than usual. Inside the meeting room, a handful of senior staff were already seated around a long, polished table. Samuel took a seat at the head of the table, and for a moment, he could feel the eyes of everyone on him. The room was silent as they all waited for Bradley to speak. "All right," Bradley began, his voice cutting through the stillness. "We're all here today to discuss the transition and expectations for our new chief surgeon." He glanced at Samuel, his eyes briefly narrowing before returning to the group. "I'm sure Dr. Johnson has a lot of experience, but let's make one thing clear. This hospital has a long-standing tradition of excellence. We don't just let anyone walk in and take over without proving themselves." Samuel's heart skipped a beat. He had expected a warm welcome. But this felt more like an interrogation. "I'm confident I'll live up to those expectations," Samuel replied evenly, his voice calm but firm. He wasn't about to let Bradley's thinly veiled challenge shake his confidence. "I'm here to work with all of you, not to take over." Bradley's eyes flicked over to the others in the room, and for a moment, Samuel could see the slightest hint of skepticism in their expressions. They weren't just judging him on his qualifications, they were judging him on his race. "Let's see how things go, then," Bradley said, his tone laced with an unspoken challenge. "We'll start with today's cases. You'll observe, assist where needed, and we'll go from there." Samuel nodded, a tight smile on his lips. He had expected nothing less. This wasn't just about proving his skills in the operating room. It was about proving he belonged here, in a room full of people who were already sizing him up. As the meeting adjourned and Samuel made his way to the surgical floor, the weight of the morning's tension lingered. He knew this was just the beginning. But what he didn't know was how much further Bradley and others would go to test his resolve. Samuel walked down the long hallway of the hospital, his footsteps echoing in the quiet. It was early in the morning, and the corridors were still relatively empty. He was getting used to the hospital's layout, but the tension he felt from the senior staff, particularly Dr. Bradley, was still fresh in his mind. He had known this wouldn't be easy, but he hadn't expected such blatant resistance from one of the most senior surgeons on the staff. As Samuel approached the surgical unit, he saw Dr. Bradley waiting by the door. The man was standing with his arms crossed, an air of impatience surrounding him. Bradley's posture was confident, maybe even arrogant, but there was something else lurking beneath the surface, a hostility Samuel couldn't quite place. "Good morning, Dr. Bradley," Samuel said, trying to sound casual. He extended his hand, but Bradley didn't immediately take it. Instead, he looked Samuel up and down, his gaze sharp and assessing. "Morning, Dr. Johnson," Bradley replied, his tone colder than Samuel had anticipated. "You're here early, I see. I hope you're ready for a long day." "I'm always ready," Samuel responded with a smile. It was important to stay composed, no matter how unsettling the situation became. He could feel Bradley's eyes on him, and though Samuel had grown used to this kind of scrutiny, it still made his skin crawl. Bradley motioned for Samuel to follow him into the operating room. "We got a busy day ahead. I don't want any mistakes." Samuel followed closely behind, his mind racing. He had heard about Bradley's reputation, respected, but with a history of clashes with people who didn't quite fit the mold. It wasn't lost on Samuel that he was walking into an environment where he was very much the outsider. Once inside the sterile, bright operating room, Bradley quickly introduced Samuel to the rest of the surgical team. They were a mix of junior doctors and seasoned nurses, all quietly awaiting orders. Samuel nodded at each of them, trying to gauge their reactions, but their faces were unreadable. He had learned long ago that in situations like this, it was often better to observe before speaking. Dr. Bradley wasted no time getting to work. He gave precise instructions to the team, his voice firm and commanding. Samuel stood off to the side, watching as the surgery began. It was a delicate procedure, and Bradley seemed intent on showing Samuel that he was in charge. "Dr. Johnson," Bradley said suddenly, turning to him, "why don't you scrub in and assist? I'm sure you'll want to get your hands dirty sooner rather than later." It was a challenge. Samuel could tell that Bradley wasn't offering him an opportunity to help. He was giving him a test. Would Samuel make a mistake? Would he fail under the pressure? Samuel didn't hesitate. He nodded and moved to scrub in. He had spent years perfecting his skills, and no one, least of all Bradley, was going to question his ability to perform. He had earned this position, and he wasn't about to back down now. As Samuel joined the surgical team, he could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him. Bradley was watching, but not in a supportive way. He was waiting for something to go wrong. He was waiting for Samuel to slip up. The surgery was long and complicated, but Samuel focused entirely on the task at hand. His hands moved with practiced precision, his mind sharp as he worked through each step. He had done procedures like this countless times before, and his confidence grew with every successful move. Bradley watched intently, his expression unreadable. Samuel couldn't tell if he was impressed or merely waiting for the moment when he could criticize. When the surgery finally came to an end, Bradley gave a curt nod. "Not bad," he said, his voice carrying an edge of reluctance. "You did all right." Samuel didn't allow himself to feel too much satisfaction at the compliment. Or was it a backhanded one? He had learned to take the wins where he could, but he wasn't fooled by Bradley's praise. He could feel the man's subtle animosity, and it was clear that he wasn't done testing Samuel. As the team began to clean up, Bradley approached him again. "You did all right," he repeated, his tone still icy. "But we'll see how things go next time. You're going to have to prove yourself here." Samuel nodded. He had expected as much, but the sting of Bradley's words was still sharp. It wasn't just the challenge. There was something more personal in the way Bradley spoke to him. It wasn't just about his abilities as a surgeon. It was about who he was and the space he had earned to occupy. "I'm here to work with the team, Dr. Bradley," Samuel said, his voice steady but firm. "Not to prove anything to you." Bradley's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, the rest of the team began to file out of the room, leaving them alone. Samuel took the opportunity to walk out, his head held high, but his mind swirling. This was only the beginning, and he knew that Bradley wasn't going to make it easy for him. As Samuel made his way down the corridor, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were only going to get more difficult from here. But he was prepared. He had worked too hard to let one man's prejudice stand in his way. He was the chief surgeon now. It was time for everyone to see what he was truly capable of. It was late afternoon by the time Samuel found himself in the hospital's break room, trying to catch his breath after a long, grueling day. He'd assisted on 2 more surgeries, one of which had been particularly difficult. The pressure of being watched by Dr. Bradley had never let up, but Samuel had managed to keep his composure. His focus had been unshakable, and he was beginning to feel like he was earning some measure of respect, even if it wasn't immediately apparent. As he leaned back in his chair, he allowed himself a moment to relax. But just as he was about to check his phone, the door to the break room opened, and in walked Dr. Bradley. "Dr. Johnson," Bradley said, his voice cutting through the stillness of the room. "We need to talk?" Samuel sat up, wiping the exhaustion from his face. "Of course, Dr. Bradley. What's on your mind?" Bradley stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "You're not exactly what I expected," he said bluntly. "I mean, sure, you've done well in the OR, but I'm not sure you fully understand what it takes to lead a department like this. We got a lot of very experienced surgeons here, and I don't think you realize how competitive things can get." Samuel remained calm, though inside, he could feel the pressure building. He had dealt with plenty of people who tried to undermine his confidence, but Bradley's words were different. There was something personal in the way he spoke to him. "I understand perfectly, Dr. Bradley," Samuel replied, his tone measured. "I've worked hard to get here, and I'm not going to let anything or anyone stand in the way of doing my job. I'm not here to compete with anyone. I'm here to lead." Bradley let out a short laugh, almost derisive. "Lead? You got to earn that right, Johnson. And I don't think you've proven yourself yet." Samuel clenched his jaw, but he didn't let his frustration show. He had learned long ago that in situations like this, reacting emotionally only played into the other person's hands. Instead, he took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "You want me to prove myself?" Samuel asked, raising an eyebrow. "Give me a challenge, Dr. Bradley. I'm more than ready." Bradley's eyes flashed, and Samuel could tell he had been waiting for this moment. He knew that Bradley wasn't about to back down. He had been testing him all along, and now it seemed he was ready to take things to the next level. "Well, there's a new case coming in tonight," Bradley said, his voice low and almost menacing. "A high-risk surgery. If you want to prove yourself, you'll take the lead on it. You'll call the shots, and you'll be responsible for everything. If you fail, it'll be on you." Samuel's heart skipped a beat. A high-risk surgery meant everything was on the line. One mistake could cost a life, and if that happened, his career would be over before it ever really began. But he didn't hesitate. "I'll take it." Bradley studied him for a moment, as though trying to gauge whether Samuel was bluffing. Finally, he nodded. "We'll see if you can handle it. You'll be on call tonight. The oar is yours." Samuel stood up, feeling the weight of the challenge settle on his shoulders. This was his chance, not just to prove his skills as a surgeon, but to show everyone that he was the right person for the job. He could feel Bradley's eyes on him, waiting for him to falter, but he wasn't going to give in. "Thank you, Dr. Bradley," Samuel said, his voice steady. "I won't let you down." As Bradley turned and left the break room, Samuel took a moment to collect his thoughts. This was it. No more second-guessing. No more waiting for approval. He was going to show them all what he was capable of. It was nearly 10 p.m. when Samuel was called into the hospital. The familiar hum of the fluorescent lights and the scent of antiseptic filled the air as he walked through the empty halls toward the operating room. He could feel the weight of the responsibility settling on his shoulders. And though he'd faced difficult surgeries before, this one felt different. It was a defining moment, not just for the patient, but for his career. When he reached the operating room, he found Dr. Bradley already there, along with the surgical team. The patient, a middle-aged man who had been involved in a serious car accident, was already prepped and unconscious on the table. The monitors beeped steadily, and the air was thick with the tension that came with every high-risk procedure. "Dr. Johnson," Bradley said, his voice sharp. "You ready for this?" Samuel nodded, trying to keep his nerves in check. "I'm ready." Bradley gave him a quick, almost dismissive glance before turning to the rest of the team. "Let's get started. Dr. Johnson is calling the shots tonight, but remember, we're all here to help. Don't make any mistakes." Samuel's fingers tightened around the sterile gloves as he scrubbed in, focusing entirely on the task at hand. The last thing he needed was for his mind to wander. There was no room for doubt or hesitation in the operating room. He was in charge, and that meant keeping his head clear. Once scrubbed in, Samuel stepped toward the patient's side. The surgical team moved with precision, anticipating his every move. He glanced at the monitors, checking the vitals one last time before making his first incision. Dr. Bradley stood off to the side, his arms crossed, watching Samuel closely. Though he said nothing, Samuel could feel the weight of his gaze, the subtle challenge in the air. Bradley wanted him to fail, but Samuel wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. The surgery was a delicate procedure. Internal bleeding needed to be controlled, and the damage to the patient's ribs was severe. Samuel worked quickly but carefully, his hands steady as he navigated through the complex anatomy. His mind raced through the steps of the operation, calling upon everything he had learned over the years. Bradley didn't speak, but his presence was unmistakable. He was still waiting for Samuel to make a mistake, still waiting for him to falter. But with every move, Samuel proved that he belonged here. He had done this before. He knew what he was doing. Hours passed, and the surgery continued. Samuel's focus never wavered, even as the minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. He could feel his exhaustion creeping in, but he pushed it aside. This was the moment that would define him, and he couldn't afford to make a mistake. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Samuel closed the wound and signaled to the team to begin the final stages of the procedure. The patient's vitals were stable, and the bleeding had been successfully controlled. It had been a success. As the team began to clean up, Dr. Bradley finally spoke. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, his voice softer than it had been all night. "You actually did it." Samuel didn't let the comment get to him. He had expected nothing more from Bradley than a grudging acknowledgement, and that's exactly what he received. But Samuel was proud. He had led the surgery, kept his cool under pressure, and ensured the patient's survival. That was all that mattered. "We're not done yet," Samuel said, keeping his voice steady. "We still need to monitor the patient closely over the next few hours." Bradley nodded, but there was a shift in his demeanor. The harshness in his eyes had softened, and for the first time, Samuel saw a hint of respect. "Good job, Dr. Johnson," Bradley said, his voice quiet but sincere. You've earned your place here." Samuel's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He had proved himself, not just to Dr. Bradley, but to everyone in that room. He had taken the challenge head-on and come out on top. And that was just the beginning. As he left the operating room, Samuel allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. He had done what they said he couldn't do. But deep down, he knew this was only the start. There would be more challenges ahead, more battles to fight. But Samuel was ready. He had earned this, and he wasn't about to back down now. The following week felt like a whirlwind. Samuel had proven himself during the high-risk surgery, but the days that followed were filled with more challenges. There were more patients to attend to, more surgeries to perform, and even more moments when Samuel could feel the weight of expectations pressing on him. He had earned his place at the hospital, but the path ahead was anything but easy. Dr. Bradley still watched him closely, but now there was a subtle shift in their interactions. The tension had lessened, though it hadn't entirely disappeared. Bradley was still a formidable presence, but Samuel no longer felt the same pressure to constantly prove himself. He had already done that. One morning, as Samuel was walking down the hallway to the surgical floor, he was stopped by one of the nurses, Lisa, a young woman who had been working at the hospital for a few years. "Dr. Johnson," she said, her voice low, "I just wanted to thank you for what you did last week. You saved that man's life. The family is so grateful." Samuel smiled at her, though he could feel a little discomfort. It wasn't the praise he was uncomfortable with. It was the constant reminder of how high the stakes were. But he appreciated the sentiment. "It was a team effort," he said. "I just did my part." Lisa shook her head. "No, it was more than that. I've seen a lot of surgeons here, but what you did, it was different. You didn't just go through the motions. You led." Samuel nodded, though the compliment still felt strange to him. Leadership was something he was still getting used to. He had always been part of a team, but now he was the one others were looking to. It was a responsibility he wasn't sure he was ready for, but he was learning. Later that day, Samuel was called into Dr. Bradley's office. He knew this meeting would be different. He could feel it in the air. Bradley hadn't summoned him to his office for a casual conversation in days, and he knew that something was about to change. When he entered, Bradley was sitting at his desk, flipping through a patient file. He didn't look up immediately, but when he did, his expression was unreadable. "Dr. Johnson," he said slowly, "I've been thinking, you've done well so far. Your performance in the OR has been impressive, and I've seen a change in how the team responds to you. But there's still a long way to go." Samuel nodded, bracing himself for what was coming next. "I understand, Dr. Bradley. I'm still learning." Bradley leaned back in his chair, studying him. "Good, because I'm going to need you to lead more than just surgeries from now on. I'm offering you the chance to take over a new program we're launching, a fellowship for up-and-coming surgeons." Samuel's eyebrows shot up. A fellowship? It was a huge responsibility, one that involved mentoring younger surgeons and making critical decisions about their training. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of responsibility just yet," Samuel said, his voice tentative. Bradley shook his head. "You are ready. You've already proven that. This isn't just about performing surgeries. It's about leading the next generation. You'll be responsible for selecting the fellows, managing their progress, and making sure they're prepared for the demands of this job." Samuel was silent for a moment, the weight of the decision settling in. It was a major step forward, but it also meant stepping up in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. He wasn't sure if he was ready to take on so much, but at the same time, he knew this was an opportunity he couldn't afford to pass up. "I'll do it," Samuel said, his voice firm. "I'll take on the fellowship program." Bradley nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Good. I knew you'd make the right choice. This is your chance to shape the future of surgery here. Don't waste it." As Samuel left the office, He couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and nervousness. This was a turning point. He had just been handed a major responsibility, one that could make or break his career. But deep down, he knew he was ready. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but Samuel had never backed down from a challenge before. And this time, he wasn't going to start. The following weeks were a blur of meetings, evaluations, and preparations for the new fellowship program. Samuel found himself balancing his surgical duties with the responsibilities of managing a group of promising young surgeons. It was a challenge he hadn't anticipated, and there were moments when he felt overwhelmed by the sheer weight of it all. But there was something else he hadn't anticipated: the resistance. Some of the younger surgeons, many of whom had been at the hospital longer than Samuel, weren't happy about the new program. They didn't understand why he, a newcomer, had been given the authority to lead it. It was one thing to be a skilled surgeon, but another to be tasked with shaping the next generation of surgeons. Samuel could feel the skepticism in the air every time he interacted with them. One afternoon, as he was reviewing applications for the fellowship, he overheard a conversation in the hallway between two of the senior surgeons, Dr. Peterson and Dr. Grant. They didn't realize Samuel was nearby, but the conversation caught his attention. "I still can't believe they gave the fellowship to him," Dr. Peterson said, his voice low but filled with disdain. "What does he know about leadership? He's just a new guy who's had a few good surgeries. He's not ready for this." Dr. Grant's voice was just as dismissive. "Yeah, I don't know what they were thinking. The guy hasn't even been here a year, and now he's in charge of training the next generation of surgeons? It's ridiculous." Samuel stood still, his heart pounding in his chest. He had expected some pushback, but hearing it so openly felt like a punch to the gut. He had worked so hard to get here, to prove himself, and yet it seemed like the people who should be supporting him were the ones doubting him the most. But instead of confronting them right then, Samuel took a deep breath and turned away. He wasn't going to let their words break him. He had a job to do, and he was going to do it to the best of his ability. He had already faced bigger challenges, and this was just another obstacle to overcome. The next day, he held the first meeting with the fellowship candidates. The room was filled with eager faces, each one hoping to be chosen for the program that would shape their future careers. Samuel stood at the front of the room, his hands steady as he began to speak. "I know some of you may be skeptical," he began, his voice calm but firm. "I know I'm not the person you expected to lead this program, but I'm here because I believe in you. I believe in your potential to be great surgeons, and I'm here to help you get there." He paused, allowing the words to sink in. "I've been where you are. I've had to prove myself time and time again, and I'm not going to lie to you. It's not going to be easy. But if you're willing to work hard, to learn, and to push yourselves, you can achieve greatness." There was a moment of silence in the room. Samuel could see the uncertainty in some of their eyes, but there was also a flicker of hope. They were listening. They wanted to believe in him. One of the candidates, a young woman named Emily, raised her hand. "Dr. Johnson, what if we fail? What if we're not good enough?" Samuel smiled at her, understanding the fear that lay behind the question. Failure is part of the process. Every surgeon has failed at some point. What matters is how we learn from that failure and keep moving forward. It's about perseverance, not perfection. The room seemed to settle after that, the tension easing as Samuel's words took root. He wasn't just leading them through a program. He was giving them hope, showing them that they had what it took to succeed, even when it felt impossible. As the meeting ended, Emily approached Samuel. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. "I needed to hear that." Samuel nodded, a sense of satisfaction settling over him. This was why he had accepted the responsibility. It wasn't about the accolades or the recognition. It was about making a difference in the lives of the people who came after him. Later that afternoon, Dr. Bradley called him into his office. Samuel wasn't sure what to expect, but when he walked in, Bradley's expression was surprisingly approving. "You're doing well, Dr. Johnson," he said. "I've been hearing good things about your leadership with the fellowship. The team is starting to come around. They're seeing that you know what you're doing." Samuel felt a rush of pride, but he didn't let it show. He had a long way to go, and the journey was far from over. But for the first time since taking on this responsibility, he felt like he was truly making a difference. "There's still a lot of work to be done," Samuel replied, keeping his focus on the future. "But I'm getting there." Bradley nodded. "Keep it up. You're earning the respect of the team. It's only a matter of time before they see you for who you really are. Not just a great surgeon, but a great leader." As Samuel left Bradley's office, he felt a sense of accomplishment. But there was also a quiet resolve within him. The challenges were far from over, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path. And that was enough to keep him moving forward. The days turned into weeks, and Samuel continued to navigate the delicate balance between leading the fellowship program and fulfilling his duties as chief of surgery. His leadership was being tested in ways he hadn't anticipated, but he was learning with each challenge. He was pushing himself harder than ever before, and yet there were moments when he still couldn't shake the doubts that lingered in the back of his mind. One of the biggest tests came when Dr. Bradley assigned him a particularly difficult case, a high-profile patient who needed complex surgery after a severe car accident. The patient's family was wealthy and influential, and the pressure to succeed was immense. It wasn't just a matter of saving the patient's life. It was about maintaining the reputation of the hospital and keeping the family's trust. As Samuel prepared for the surgery, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the responsibility. He knew that this was a moment that could make or break his career. If he succeeded, it would cement his place as a leader in the field. But if he failed, it could ruin everything. The morning of the surgery arrived, and Samuel was already in the OR, reviewing the patient's charts and double-checking the surgical plan. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing. This wasn't just another surgery. It was a test of everything he had worked for. When the surgical team arrived, Samuel took charge immediately. He outlined a plan, delegated tasks, and made sure everyone was prepared. The tension in the room was palpable, but Samuel remained calm. He had done everything he could to prepare. Now, all he had to do was trust in his skills and in the team around him. The surgery began, and for the first hour, everything went smoothly. But then, as they began to repair the patient's internal injuries, complications arose. The bleeding was more severe than anticipated, and they were running out of time. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest as he focused on the patient's vitals, but his mind was clear. He had faced crises before, and he wasn't about to let this one get the best of him. Dr. Johnson, Dr. Peterson, one of the senior surgeons on the team, called out, "We need to make a decision. We can't keep going like this. The patient's vitals are dropping." Samuel didn't hesitate. "Increase the pressure and prepare for a transfusion. We're not giving up on this patient." The room fell silent as the team followed his orders. Samuel's confidence was unwavering, and his presence was a steadying force in the midst of chaos. He moved with precision, making decisions quickly and efficiently. He was no longer just the surgeon performing the operation. He was the leader guiding the team through a critical moment. It felt like an eternity, but finally, after what seemed like hours, the bleeding was controlled and the patient's condition stabilized. Samuel let out a quiet breath of relief, but he didn't allow himself to relax. There was still work to be done. As the surgery continued, Samuel's mind raced with the implications of what had just happened. He had been tested in a way he hadn't expected, and yet he had come through. The pressure had been immense, but he had held it together. This was what leadership was all about, making decisions under pressure and guiding a team through the toughest moments. When the surgery was finally over, Samuel stood by the operating table, watching as the patient was carefully wheeled out of the room. His team followed him out of the OR, and as they gathered in the hallway, Samuel felt the weight of their eyes on him. They were looking to him for guidance, and he had delivered. "Good work, everyone," Samuel said, his voice calm but firm. "We pulled through together." Dr. Peterson, who had been critical of Samuel in the past, looked at him with a new respect. "That was impressive, Dr. Johnson. You handled the pressure like a pro." Samuel nodded, though he couldn't help but feel a sense of disbelief. He had faced the most difficult surgery of his career, and he had emerged victorious. It was a moment he would never forget. Later that day, Samuel received a call from Dr. Bradley. "I heard about the surgery," he said, his voice steady. "You did well." "Very well." Samuel felt a rush of pride, but he didn't let it show. "Thank you. I couldn't have done it without the team." Bradley's tone shifted slightly, a hint of approval in his voice. "You're earning their respect, Dr. Johnson. And mine as well. You've proved that you're more than just a great surgeon. You're a leader. Samuel felt a sense of accomplishment, but there was something more important than the praise. He had faced the test, and he had passed. He had shown that he was capable of leading in the most difficult moments. And that was something no one could take away from him. As the days passed, Samuel's confidence continued to grow. He wasn't just a surgeon anymore. He was a leader, someone who could be trusted to handle any challenge that came his way. The respect he had earned from his colleagues was hard-won, but it was finally his. Weeks passed since the challenging surgery, and Samuel's reputation within the hospital had been solidified. No longer just the new chief of surgery, he had become a respected figure among his peers. The whispers of doubt that once surrounded him had all but disappeared. Instead, there was a newfound respect, not just for his skill as a surgeon, but for his ability to lead, make tough decisions, and maintain composure under pressure. But Samuel knew the battle wasn't over. Every day was still a challenge, and there were still moments where his leadership would be tested. The true test of a leader wasn't in their success, but in how they handled the ongoing trials. And for Samuel, it wasn't just about his career anymore. It was about creating a lasting impact, one that would change the hospital for the better. One afternoon, as he walked down the long corridor toward the surgery wing, he passed Dr. Bradley's office. To his surprise, the door was open, and Bradley was sitting at his desk, looking over some reports. Seeing an opportunity to talk, Samuel knocked softly before entering. "Dr. Bradley," Samuel said with a respectful nod, "I just wanted to check in. I've been hearing some positive feedback from the team lately." Bradley looked up from his papers and smiled, though it was more of a knowing grin than a proud one. "I've noticed that too. You've made a real difference around here, Samuel. The team respects you, and I think you've finally found your place." Samuel nodded, grateful for the acknowledgement, but his mind was already on the next step. "I want to take this further," he said, his voice firm. "The fellowship program is just the beginning. I want to do more for this hospital, especially in terms of diversity. We need to create a space where future surgeons, regardless of their background, have equal opportunities. I'm tired of seeing the same old patterns of exclusion." Bradley's eyes softened. "I've been hearing some of the same concerns from other doctors around here. You're right. This hospital has always prided itself on its excellence in surgery, but it could do more to foster diversity. I'm glad you're bringing this up." Samuel leaned forward, passion filling his voice. "We can't just be a hospital where excellence is defined by a handful of individuals. We need to create an environment where everyone, no matter their race, gender, or background, feels that they belong. I want to help shape that, to make this hospital a place where we don't just heal bodies, but we heal the broken systems that have held others back." Bradley studied Samuel for a moment, then gave a slow nod. "You've got the vision, and I think you've got the leadership to make it happen." Samuel felt a surge of hope. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight. But with Bradley's support, he knew it was possible. For the first time in a long while, he could see a future where change was not only possible, but inevitable. The next few months were a whirlwind. Samuel began to roll out new initiatives aimed at improving diversity in the hospital's surgical departments. He established mentorship programs, designed outreach initiatives, and worked closely with the hospital's administration to ensure that these changes were not just talk, but actions that could be measured and sustained. As the new programs took shape, something remarkable began to happen. The hospital, once divided and hesitant, began to come together. Samuel's commitment to fairness and inclusion was contagious, inspiring others to reevaluate their own biases and perceptions. Slowly but surely, the culture at the hospital began to shift, becoming more inclusive, more welcoming, and more unified. But Samuel knew that the journey wasn't over. There would always be challenges to face, new obstacles to overcome. But that was part of leadership. It wasn't just about the good moments. It was about the perseverance in the face of adversity. And Samuel was ready for whatever came next. One day, as Samuel walked through the halls, he noticed Dr. Peterson approaching him. For a moment, Samuel wondered if Peterson would continue to harbor resentment. But as they locked eyes, Peterson's expression was different. There was a hint of respect in his gaze, something that hadn't been there before. "You've done a lot for this place, Samuel," Peterson said quietly. "I've seen the changes. I didn't always agree with you, but I can't deny the impact you've had. This place is better for it." Samuel smiled, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. "Thank you, Dr. Peterson. That means more than you know." As he continued his walk through the hospital, Samuel reflected on how far he had come. He had faced adversity, dealt with racism, and proved himself in the operating room. But more than that, he had forged a new path for himself, a path that didn't just focus on personal success, but on creating a better environment for everyone who walked through the hospital doors. The road ahead was still long, but Samuel knew one thing for sure. He was ready. He had found his purpose, and it wasn't just about healing bodies. It was about healing the systems that kept people from reaching their full potential. And that was a journey he would continue, no matter what challenges lay ahead.